Hitler has only got one Bulgari, as to the very small. Hitler has something similar, but Coral Goebbels has no balls at all.
That's interesting, right? You know the tune, right? I knew the tune from when I was little. I had no idea what it was to, though.
I want to give you the truth, folks. The truth about America. I know you've got a lot of questions. You want to know why you're not getting the breaks you deserve. Well, I'm not a politician, but I've made it my business to study these things, and I happen to know the facts.
You mean you know the opinions, not the facts, the opinions. It is literally not the facts that this guy's presenting. Anyway, Hitler did this exact thing. They're portraying Hitler right now. I know that surprises you because you're thinking, wow, I've heard this nutcase on a corner screaming about how great, like, Donald Trump is, for example, a billion times. This is exactly how it happens. This is populist language. I don't want to watch this video about World War II. It's called Don't Be a Sucker, produced by the U.S. military in, I think, 1948, maybe? And it was intended to de-brainwash people and make them understand what was wrong with the Nazi movement. So let's just kind of glance through. The word denazification for the first time appeared in, it was from the Pentagon, and it appeared in 1943, I believe. And they were writing up plans for how they were going to denazify after the war, basically, after they took Germany. And this film was part of the denazification efforts for the United States. So denazification lasted from 1945 to 1948, and then it ended. And it was largely viewed as a colossal failure. I wrote about why and what they could have done differently and why I believe it wasn't a failure in my book. Again, Was Hitler an Atheist? Last chapter. But this is part of the denazification effort, so let's give this a listen. Don't be a sucker.
Free people. They can live together and work together and build America together because they're free. Free to vote, to say what they pleased, go to their own churches, to pick.
The reason they showed the Lutheran Church is because, again, I wrote about this at length. Lutheran Church was the main Protestant denomination in Germany at the time. That's why this is up here. I think this is probably a Catholic church based on how ornate it is. That was the other denomination of Christianity. It was Catholicism. And we'll talk about how Lutheranism and Catholicism interacted with the Third Reich as we go. Just keep listening.
I'm not a politician, but I've made it my business to study these things, and I happen to know the facts. Now, friends, I'm just an average American. But I'm an American, and some of the things I see in this country of ours make my blood boil. I see people with foreign accents making all the money. I see Negroes holding jobs that belong to me and you.
I mean, it's kind of on the nose how similar this sounds to rhetoric from today, right? Oh my God, this is exactly the type of shit that we hear today from people. Immigrants making all the money, stealing our jobs. Does that sound familiar? It's populist language. It's the same strategy, the same rhetorical style that Hitler used. Now, if you want to be like Hitler, that's fine. Go nuts. But I'm going to talk shit about you is all.
Negroes holding jobs that belong to me and you. Now, I ask you, if we allow this thing to go on, what's going to become of us real Americans?
I've heard this kind of talk before, but I never expected to hear it in America.
It's very intentionally and specifically designed to sound like Hitler.
This fellow seems to know what he's talking about.
Yes, he knows all right.
What's the answer? What are we real Americans going to do about it? You'll find it right here in this little pamphlet. The truth about Negroes and foreigners. The truth about the Catholic Church. Now, friends, these books are free. Paid for by real Americans who want others to know the truth.
Excuse me, young man, but are you actually going to read that stuff?
Sure, why not? You heard what he said, didn't you?
Yes, I heard.
Yeah, that's the point. We heard what he said, yes.
Do you believe in that kind of talk?
I don't know, makes pretty good sense to me.
I'm speaking to you as an American. And I tell you, friends, we'll never be able to call this country our own until it's a country without. Without what? Yeah, without what? Without Negroes. Without alien foreigners. Without Catholics. Without Freemasons. You know these things.
What's wrong with the Masons? I'm a Mason.
Freemasons were a really popular group at the time, all over the place. And, I mean, including in Germany. And there really wasn't anything special about them. They were just like another social club, like the Lions Club. I don't know if you guys remember the Lions Club. It's just a little group of people get together, hang out together, and talk about things and try to do charitable work. Yeah, that's what the Freemasons were, and what they are, honestly. The big secret about the Freemasons is that there is no secret.
Hey, that fella's talking about me.
And that makes a difference, doesn't it?
Hitler did all this stuff, as you'll see. They'll show in a minute. But the reason Hitler did this, I don't know about the guy on screen or Trump or whoever else. I don't know about them. But Hitler did this specifically because he wanted to break down any associations that weren't from the Nazi Party specifically. Like, in Germany, there were a billion different political parties and social clubs and everything else. And Hitler wanted to erase all of that individuality. Every single little group out there had their own social clubs. They had their own after-school programs, their own version of the Boy Scouts. They all had their own sewing circles, their own everythings. Communists and Catholics and everybody of all different types. They all had their own thing. Well, the Catholics made a deal with the Nazis. The Catholic Church did. It's called the Reichskonkordat in 1933, on my birthday, weirdly. Anyway, they made a deal with them that the Nazis would allow the Catholic Church to continue to run, like, Catholic schools. And the Nazis basically immediately violated that. They weren't allowed to eventually run Catholic schools or their after-school clubs or anything. Everybody had to join the Nazi Party, pretty much. So, anyway, or join the Nazi version of, like, the Boy Scouts, which was the Hitler Youth. Anyway, Hitler tried desperately to break down associations, connections, ties. He didn't want people to have ties to their community. He wanted them to have ties to the Nazi Party.
These are your enemies. These are the people who are trying to take over our country. Now you know them. You know what they stand for. And it's up to you and me to fight them. Fight them and destroy them before they destroy us. Thank you.
One over here clapping. Love it.
Before he said Masons, you were ready to agree with him.
Well, yes, but he was talking about, what about those other people?
It's always about the other people, never about you, huh?
But in this country, we have no other people. We are American people.
This is the important point to get. They were Germans. They were all Germans. There was no Aryan whatever. There was no split like that. Aryan isn't even real. You know, for that matter, Semite isn't even real. Did you guys realize that? I found that out recently. Semite is not a real racial distinction. There is no common origin between, like, the Israelites and Egyptians and all, you know, whoever else is in that little region, the Levant. The only reason the word Semite or Semitic exists is because it's still a language designation, because they do have a common language origin, some of them.
We are American people, all of us.
What about you? You aren't American, are you?
I was born in Hungary, but now I am an American citizen. And I have seen what this kind of talk can do. I saw it in Berlin.
What were you doing then?
I was a professor at the university. I heard the same words we have heard today. But I was a fool then. I thought Nazis were crazy people, stupid fanatics.
Does that sound familiar to anybody else? Is this familiar? Again, the percentage of Nazis compared to the general population was really low. Like, lower than you would think. That's something called a denouncement program. Basically, the Gestapo is kind of like the FBI, I suppose. And they would tap phones, and they would track people, and all that, you know. They had this denouncement system where you could denounce somebody for doing something that could be considered subversive to the state. Anybody could, children or whatever. And if a parent said good morning to their kid instead of Heil Hitler, the kid could denounce the parent. Gestapo comes and investigates, tears their life apart, leaves it in shambles. Even if they're real full-blown Nazi supporters, their life is destroyed now. because they've asked all of their friends about their subversive activities and everything else, and now their friends have left them, and their church has kicked them out and everything else because they don't trust them anymore, because they don't want trouble. It came to a point where children were denouncing teachers for giving too much homework. It was widespread. It was wild. People would denounce others like 5 times a day sometimes. There were block wardens, so every city block or every like little suburb, every street had a block warden, and he was like a member of the Nazi Party in good standing that knew everybody and talked to them, said, how's it going? You know, help people with their flowers and all that stuff. Just keep tabs on everybody all the way across the board. And a lot of denouncements came from them. And surprisingly, the Gestapo investigated every single denouncement, every one of them. And they wrote them down, and they kept them in a big filing room when the Allies invaded Germany and took the entire area. They discovered this filing room with 12 million denouncements, or 12 million people with denouncement records. That is a lot of denouncements, right? But there were 60 million people total, or so, you know, depending on which territories you count, because they took territories later on. So 12 million divided by 60 million is about 20%. So I'm basing my numbers off of that, and also off the fact that about 15% of the pastors in the Protestant church were on lists that the Allies drew up to remove them because they were affiliated with the Nazi cause in some way. So we'll say 15 to 20% were full-blown involved Nazis and believers. And everybody else was kind of in a concentric circle. Like some of them believed, the outer ring of these ideas. Kind of like QAnon, I guess. You know, there are some deep QAnon believers, but others just kind of accept some of the QAnon claims, like Trump is somebody special, or the election was stolen, or whatever. Those are QAnon beliefs, but you're not a full-blown QAnoner for believing it.
Nazis were crazy people.
Right. So this guy thought Nazis were crazy people, fanatics. Well, they were, but they took over the entire thing. There are more Trump supporters than there were Nazi fanatics at the time. I don't know, that's a tall claim. Maybe that's not right. Maybe it's about the same. When I say Trump supporters, I mean full-blown fanatic nutcases. Maybe it's about the same. Yeah, maybe there were as many Nazis at the time as there are Trump supporters today. 15 to 20% of Germany were full-blown Nazi supporters. I would guess 15 to 20% of Americans are full-blown Trump nutcases. I mean, he obviously gets like 40% of the voters, whatever it is, 50, I don't know. But a lot of those people just voting for him because he's, the guy on the Republican ticket.
I thought Nazis were crazy people, stupid fanatics. But unfortunately, it was not so.
Well, it is so, but that's fascinating to think about, isn't it? That it's kind of like if the Trump supporters, the nutcases took over. One of the big differences, though, is that Donald Trump is like, he's got one foot in the grave, one on a banana peel at this point. And Hitler was young. He was in his 40s when everything really went down. All right, so he was 56 in 1945. So 25 years earlier, when things really started going down, he was 31. When he took control of the Nazi Party officially and renamed it from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialists.
You see, they knew that they were not strong enough to conquer a unified country. So they split Germany into small groups. They used prejudice as a practical weapon to cripple the nation.
Yeah, and they forced people in those small groups to leave those small groups and join the larger Nazi group. That was the goal.
Of course, that was not easy to do. They had to work hard to do it. You see, we human beings are not born with prejudices. Always they are made for us.
I thought about this for a while and researched it. That's accurate, actually. If your grandparents had never been exposed to anti-black bigotry, for example, if they'd never heard a racist comment, they wouldn't be racist against black people. It's not in us to be like that. It's made. It's produced. We are not racist by default.
Made by someone who wants something. Remember that when you hear this kind of talk. Somebody is going to get something out of it. And it isn't going to be you.
Well said, right?
This is not classroom theory. I saw it happen. I saw it first in Berlin in 1932.
1932, so between 1920 and 1922, it was created and then renamed to the National Socialists, and then Hitler took over. I don't remember what the chain of events was now. It's all in my book, by the way. Was Hitler an Atheist? Amazon and Audible. Check it out. He spent the next 3 years from when he took it over basically whipping people into a blood frenzy over the wrongs experienced, and he planned an insurrection on the Capitol, which was called the Beer Hall Putsch, because it started in a beer hall, basically. Started in like a bar. And he got everybody he gathered them all into this bar in this area, and then he sent them to the Capitol to riot. He pushed his way to the front, and he had a gun in his hand. Anyway, his second-in-command, Goring, got shot in the That's neither here nor there. He went to jail for 9 months after that. That was 1923, I believe. He wrote Mein Kampf while in jail. And over the course of the next 8 years, or whatever, 1925 to 1932, so 7 years, he spent time going out there and freaking people out, sending out posters and putting things up on walls, and he created a little private bodyguard group called the Brown Shirts, the SA. The SA would go around to union halls. It was kind of like the Proud Boys, very much like the Proud Boys. In fact, it was almost identical to how the Proud Boys worked. In fact, the Proud Boys probably knew that and modeled their system after the Brown Shirts, if I had to guess. Anyway, the Brown Shirts would go around and storm union halls. They'd go in and they would just wreck shit. And they would beat people up in the streets. Any political opponents that were coming against Hitler would get their asses beat, basically. Like, they'd be walking home from work and someone come out of a dark alley and beat the shit out of them, that kind of thing. Until people are just, like, afraid to challenge Hitler. He was not popular at this time, by the way. He kept running in elections, and he was a protest vote. Nobody liked him. Everybody thought he was a fanatic, and they were right. But he was building his movement off of an underlying cultural phenomenon called the Folkish movement. Volkisch. They were people that called themselves the Folk, VOLK. And the movement wasn't created by Houston Stewart Chamberlain, but it was very much like he breathed life into it. He got people all freaked out over all this stuff and claimed that, like, Aryans were the only true good Germans, and there were only 2 races in the world. There was the Aryan and the Semite. And the Semite, the Jews, were the eternal enemies of the Aryans. Aryans were strong and intelligent and powerful, and the Semites were shifty and evil. And the only reason the Semites have survived is because they've been leeching off of the Aryans. Aryans are stronger and more intelligent than normal human beings. And the only reason that they could even be possibly, like, in a position where they could be beaten up by, like, a Semite, for example, is because the Semites set out to poison the Aryan blood by breeding with the Aryans to make them weaker intentionally, to bring them down to their level. Like, that was the idea. It was in a book called Foundations of the 19th Century, released in 1899 by Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Again, all in my book. Super interesting. Chapter 1. So Hitler was building his whole movement off of the folkish ideology. And though he was unpopular, his connection to the folkish ideology catapulted him to the top eventually. By 1932, he was catapulting to the top. Sounds like the 1930s version of the Great Replacement. It is. That's where it came from. Actually, the Great Replacement came from a document called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, produced in 1902, or compiled into a book at least in 1902. The claim was in there that Jews or that Semites are trying to replace everybody slowly at the top. They're trying to get people to the very top of industry to replace them. Hitler picked that up in the 1920s, 1930s. He mentioned it in Mein Kampf, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And in 1923, I believe, a London newspaper discovered the source of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It was a book. It was a French satire book from 1854. Plagiarized. Like 90% of it was plagiarized from a satire book, not even about Jews or anything. Anyway, you say Great Replacement. That's from that era, that term. That's from then. So anyway, yeah, it's definitely the Great Replacement of the 30s. Or more accurately, modern Great Replacement is the modern version of the Great Replacement from the 30s. This is going to be a long video, but it's interesting in my opinion, so I want to cover it. Let me just show you a televangelist explaining what they believed that Jews were doing at the time, what Hitler believed Semites were doing. This is Lance Wallnau explaining what he intends to do to the United States. He adopted the plan from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, from Hitler, and is trying to implement it.
3% of the population, roughly 3 to 4% of the population, are radical leftist elites.
I mean, it's just bullshit, but okay.
30% of the population are evangelical born-again Christians that are inclined to go towards Pentecostal language. I mean, we're really out there.
No, but okay.
30% against 3%, but they neutralize the church because they're also in religion. They changed the definition of marriage, so they've taken over family. They've totally taken over academia.
The 7 mountains, academia, business, economy, military, government, I think church and family.
The education institutions are teaching leftist theology or leftist ideology.
It's just bull.
And silencing conservatives. They're controlling government right now. They've taken over legacy media, Hollywood, entertainment, and arts, and now they've got Wall Street. This is 3%. 30% of the population is Christian. How is it that 30% are dominated by 3%? They have a worldview for bringing their kingdom here now. We're told to pray thy kingdom come, but we put it off to the second coming.
So anyway, the point is that he's trying to get people to take those positions of authority in government and military and, you know, business and everything else. This is literally the exact plan that anti-Semitic nutcases claimed Jews were implementing from the 1900s all the way clear to the 1940s. It's just like somebody sat down and read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and said, this is actually a really good plan. Let's try this. Somebody along the line knows. Is it Lance Wallnau? Did he read that document? I don't know. Somebody did. It's just insane to me. Anyway, the point is that Hitler built his whole ideology off of an already existing framework, and that's why it didn't take much to get it more popular. So we've got, this is a rally in 1932. At this point, it was inevitable. Nazis were way more popular than they were previously by this year, and things started going downhill.
Berlin in 1932. 5 young men that I knew were standing in the crowd listening to the Nazi speaker. Eric was a Catholic. Anton, a student of mine, was a Jew. Heinrich owned a small hardware store. Karl was a farmer. And Hans was an unemployed metal worker.
To all true Aryan Germans.
Like, Aryan is a fake designation. It doesn't exist. It's like calling somebody a schmoobly-gong. It's not real. There is no common ancestry or whatever, but okay.
I say it is time you inherited the nation which rightfully belongs to you. To you alone belongs the glorious destiny of the greater Germany. The Nazi Party will provide land for the farmer, work for the worker, and profits for the small businessman. Who is getting these things now? The Jew.
You want to know what's really funny? Actually, Hitler even promised the men wives in this situation. He said, all the men will even get wives to marry. Really? I mean, it was so over-the-top ridiculous, and everybody recognized it as such. But they got sucked in anyway. Again, it didn't take that many people to kind of take control. Only 15 to 20% were full-blown Nazi nutcases, and they took control of the whole country eventually, so.
Getting these things now. The Jew. The Jew who has stolen our nation and our birthright. Who makes all the money and takes all our jobs. The Jew! He must be shunned. He must be ostracized. He must be eliminated.
Is this sounding familiar at all? Who takes all of our jobs and money? I mean, really, can it get any more on the nose than this? Goebbels, the propaganda minister of the administration, he wasn't extremely influential yet, but he would be very soon after this is set in 1932. He would say things like, they need to be eliminated. You know, he would trip on the word executed and pretend that he actually meant to say eliminated rather than executed intentionally. That's part of propaganda. That's what it's all about.
And the Catholics. We don't want our great nation run by a foreign church. We Germans will know what to do with these people when the time comes.
The reason they were attacking the Catholic Church at the time was not because they didn't like the Catholic Church necessarily. It was because they were trying to force the Catholic Church into supporting them. And within 12 months of these events taking place, the Catholic Church would sign the Reichskonkordat, an agreement with an agreement with the Third Reich, with Hitler, that basically said, if you allow us to continue to run Catholic schools, control the education system, and keep our after-school clubs, like our version of the Boy Scouts, and things like that, we will swear an oath of loyalty to you. The person that wrote it was a guy named Pacelli, who would be Pope Pius XII. He wrote it. Pope Pius XI had his Secretary of State, Pacelli, write the Reichskonkordat and sign it with Hitler. So anyway, he signed this document, and there was actually widespread outrage that they, among bishops and priests, that they were expected to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. However, there was a split. There was a moral split in Catholicism, which isn't very common because the Pope is like the final authority on this stuff, right? When there's a moral question that's like up in the air, the Pope calls it. He makes the decision. But he didn't in this case. He didn't speak up against Nazism or anything at all. Nothing. He just said nothing, which led to, in my book, both an Acts of Evil section and an Acts of Virtue section. For example, there was a guy named Father Kuhn from Budapest that went around with a basically like a company of Nazi soldiers executing Jews, and he would yell, "In the name of Christ, fire," as they aimed their guns at the Jews. That's just one simple example. If the Pope had unequivocally and beyond question said, what the Nazis are doing is wrong, if you support it, you will be excommunicated. If he had put down this hard moral line, as he does with abortion and immigration and every other political issue, if he had done that at the time, Hitler may not have ever won. Catholics made up, well, it depends on what time you're counting, but roughly a third of the country of Germany. They predominantly controlled the South. So the last poll that was done, I believe, was in 1939, and they had annexed some territories at the time, so their population of Catholics had gone up. But it was 41% Catholic, Germany was, 54% Protestant, which is mainly Lutheran, some Reformed Church, predecessor to Presbyterian, and then United Churches were a combination of Lutheran and Reformed Church. 54% Protestant, 41% Catholic, I believe 3.5% believe in God, and then 1.5% atheist. If the Pope had come out and said, no, things would have ended differently. There was moral ambiguity among Pope Pius XI and Pope Pius XII. Pope Pius XI died in 1939, February 10th, the day before he was supposed to deliver a scathing encyclical, basically denouncing Nazism completely. He died the day before. There was a big conspiracy about, was he killed or what? No, he wasn't killed. He was just old, and he knew he was on his last leg. So Pope Pius XII, Pacelli, takes over in 1939, and he continues XI's practice of just letting things play out. It was so stupid. The Catholic Church was demonized, and as a result, they signed the Concordat, and they just, went with the flow for the most part. There was a lot of tension later on. We'll get to that.
They and their faith must be destroyed. Then there are the Freemasons. In Germany, we have no place for secret societies. There will be only one society, and that is the Nazi Party. There will be no secrecy about that in the new Greater Germany.
One by one, he attacked each minority and he split them off one from the other. These men were all fellow Germans when they came here today. Now they were split into rival groups, suspicious of each other, hating each other. They were being swindled, all of them. But the man who was really being fooled was Hans. He was pure German, according to Nazi standards. To him they promised everything, and he fell for it.
Yeah, this is how I feel about people who fall for Trump craziness. Like my brother fell for Trump nonsense in August, I understand, 2024. And I lived with the dude for a while, like not even that long ago. In 2013, I lived with him. I moved to Florida and I was trying to get up on my feet with a new job there and everything, and I lived there. And now it's like, is he really that much of a sucker? He is. He's a sucker. I mean, he's all the way down the rabbit hole. It's just sad, man. It's sad when people fall down this rabbit hole of being a sucker.
True Aryan Germans will share the glorious destiny of our fatherland. You are the pure-blooded, the master race. It is your divine right to rule, and the Nazi Party stands ready to put you into power. It is for you to command all Germany, and someday the entire world.
He was a Superman now, an Ubermensch as they called him, an Aryan. He was special, Hans was.
That's how Hans became a Superman. They gave him a uniform and they pumped up his ego. He wasn't just a little fellow out of work anymore. He was a member of the master race.
You know that salute, that Nazi thing there? You know that's called the Bellamy salute, and Americans did that when saying the Pledge of Allegiance until the 40s? Crazy, right? There are pictures of American children in schools doing the Hitler salute to the flag. I guess Hitler kind of ruined that salute. Another thing he ruined, right? I can't have that mustache now either. He ruined so much shit. What about the book title, My Struggle? I have a struggle. I can't use that name now because it's stupid. Ruined it for everybody. Chalk it up as another thing he ruined. The Bellamy salute. Thanks.
His wife couldn't quite understand. Even though he was a Superman, there wasn't any food in the house.
Ubermensch, Superman. And the enemies were Untermensch, undermen, or subhuman, if you will.
Stupid woman. Didn't she realize that the Nazis were going to make jobs for everybody? There would be plenty of food and clothing and a new house. Everything they wanted. The glorious future of Germany was to be theirs.
Actually, Hitler did try to make this happen, and I'll tell you how he did it. It was psychotic. The Nazi Party created an incredibly prosperous economy. Oh my God, it was good. Through slave labor. They started sending people away around this time, as a matter of fact. 1933 is really when it started happening, the T4 program. They started culling children that they thought weren't Nazi material. They were euthanizing them. Doctors would put a plus sign or a minus sign on their charts if they thought that they were of good breeding stock or of bad breeding stock. If they had some congenital issue or something, they'd put a minus. The Nazi Party would come around and put them in a van and say, we're going to take your kid to a summer camp, and they'd never see them again. They would take them and they'd euthanize them. They did it not with children. I'm sorry. They did it not just with children, but also with disabled people. That's how it started. And eventually, instead of just euthanizing them, they started putting them in camps, work camps, forced labor camps. They were concentrated in these camps in high numbers, and they were forced to work or go to the crematorium. And they would work every day while ash rained on them of their friends and their family members. I mean, it was real psychotic stuff. But the concentration camp survival rate was actually pretty good in some of them. It was like 2 to 5 years in Sachsenhausen, for example, because it wasn't explicitly a death camp. Eventually, it was a political prisoners camp. So they would work them into the ground. If they died, they died. But they weren't explicitly, intentionally setting out to kill those people. They were using them as forced labor in that specific case. I think they had like 6 explicit death camps. Dachau was one of them. I think Ravensbrück, Buchenwald. I could be wrong, so don't quote me on those. Anyway, the German economy was really, really good because anybody that was subversive or whatever, Jehovah's Witnesses, political dissidents, communists. Well, communists were mostly just killed out of pocket, but people who were accused of being communists but probably weren't, they had a little red triangle they were given, and they sewed it onto their outfit. Green triangles were for criminals, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, Pink for homosexuals. I'm just using the terms that they used at the time because it's, the original language. I don't mean to be offensive. Brown was for gypsies. Roma is the proper term now, but that's the term in the literature. So anyway, they sent all these people to these camps and forced them to manufacture things for the war effort and stuff, which made the German government extremely prosperous because they were getting free labor, which means that they can build houses and things for people. Like a ton of houses were built by the German government and just like given to people practically. So the German people were benefiting from slave labor like this. There's a point at which Hitler decided he was going to ramp up the war machine covertly. That's when people stopped benefiting from the slave labor and the war machine kicked into gear and started sucking up all the extra resources. So people had to go back to ration cards again. They could only get a certain number of eggs per month, a certain amount of milk every month and things. After World War I, in 1919 to 1922, Germany faced the most intense hyperinflation the world has ever seen, ever, in recorded history. Now they're ramping up for World War II, covertly, in the 30s, and they're experiencing the rationing again, and it's not good. They don't like this. So anyway, Hans had sound expectations, but it all came crashing down, and it wasn't long before it happened either.
And their children would someday rule the world. But his wife, silly woman, still wondered where the next meal was coming from. Hans didn't like that kind of talk. It was dangerous. For that kind of talk, people should be put in jail.
And they were, yep. I mean, they didn't take everybody who was subversive or questionable or whatever. They didn't put them all in a concentration camp. They had jails, too. Like Tegel Prison, I believe, was in Berlin, and it was a Gestapo jail, basically. Sometimes, like, they couldn't, they weren't sure or whatever. So they still had, like, a normal penal system. It just, they also had the concentration camps and stuff.
Hans had swallowed the bait all right. And these were the men who baited the hook. Why? So that Hans could come to power? Of course not. So they could come to power.
Absolutely, dude. This is such a good film. I love this.
They would merely use Hans to help them get there. He would do the dirty work for them. Hans and thousands of others like him, all playing a sucker's game. They gambled with other people's liberty, and of course they lost their own. A nation of suckers. Hitler needed these people.
Dude, look at this guy's hair in the back. You seeing this? What an idiot. Does this guy not have a comb? Do you know what a comb is? What's happening here? What is this? What a stupid loser, right? Bro's got that anime hair, right? Exactly.
There was lots of work to be done. There were trade unions to be smashed, because unions were organized and might offer resistance. There were many political parties in Germany. These the Nazis destroyed. They were determined to smash every organization where people might band together and resist them.
Yeah, communists were actually complete nutcases at the time. Oh, they were out of control crazy. They were trying to take over Germany the same way that Nazis were. It was bad. They were unglued from reality. However, they also didn't want democracy, just like the Nazis. So at a certain point, the Nazi Party and the Communist Party, they were growing. And eventually it came to the point where the two of them combined outnumbered every other party. So the Nazi Party and the Communist Party reached over 50% combined. And that meant that any political party that wanted to attain power or whatever had to make a deal with one of those two parties. And so the question is, do you want Nazis or do you want communists? And I know communism is like just, it's a political ideology today. That's not what it was then. They were insane. They were like Nazis. As Richard J. Evans puts it in his book, The Coming of the Third Reich, communists would trade punch for punch, shot for shot in the streets with Nazis. They were equally as insane. And that's really the moment at which democracy died. That moment when the first poll came out showing that Nazis and communists together were over 50%. Then the Catholic Church had to make a decision between Nazis and communists, pretty much. This is an argument in favor of the Catholic Church's decisions. And they chose to endorse the Nazis because communism came prepackaged with atheism, and the Catholic Church probably rightly assumed that if they supported the communists, they'd be next on the chopping block. The very first act that the communists would take when they got into office is to ban the church. So it was kind of a gamble. At least under Nazis, the Catholic Church could continue to exist. There'd be heavy persecution, but they thought they could mitigate some of that damage by making deals with them. That's the defense of the Catholic Church. Like I said, they could have taken hard stands, especially later when they realized, like when communists had clearly lost, they had no chance of winning. They could have taken a hard stand. So the Communist Party, they were the main resistance against the Nazis, and they were at each other's throats. They hated each other. The other main competitor in this whole thing were the Social Democrats. They were a left-leaning, kind of a progressive party, very much like the progressives in America today. They were the shit, and their symbol was, much like the Nazis had the swastika. Hold on, I have a picture of this. Give me a second. I'll pull the picture up. Again, it's in my book, I believe. What was Hitler an Atheist? Amazon and Audible, give it a look. This is a picture of the Social Democrats' posters, basically, around election time. It's called the Three Arrows. They wanted to destroy monarchy, the crown, which is like, because before the Nazis, there was a monarchy. There was an emperor, Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm II. Anyway, they wanted to destroy monarchy, Nazism, and communism. The three arrows. And they used these three arrows. They'd spray paint three arrows across swastikas in public and stuff as a kind of a resistance activity or whatever. Anyway, if you ever hear of the three arrows, it's because they were the symbols of the Social Democrats in Germany at the time. The three arrows is an absolutely awesome symbol. Social Democrats were an awesome political party. Love them to death. Anyway, so Nazis were destroying the Social Democrats, but by this time, 1932, 33, Social Democrats were not as popular anymore. They had been the strongest party in Germany, but by this point, they weren't anymore.
There were Jews to be beaten and killed. The Jews were not powerful, but they were a convenient excuse for all the nation's ills. And besides, a Nazi party member could not take over this man's store. Hundreds of Catholics were put in jail because the Catholic Church had strength and could resist the Nazi drive for power.
Religion's relationship with the Nazi Party is complicated and was unacceptable to discuss, even in academic circles, until about 1980. Wolfgang Gerlach wrote a book titled "And the Witnesses Were Silent" on this subject, and it was the first book on this subject, maybe ever. It certainly that went in this much depth. But he opened the floodgates, Gerlach did. And since then, there have been many books about religious interaction, or the interaction of religious denominations with the Nazi Party. Most are out of print now. Even more are like really, really hard to find. So good luck finding any of them. But if you want to know which sources I use, for example, it's on my website, owenmorgan.com. It's in the menu. You'll see extras, was Hitler an atheist, something. I have the sources on there anyway. In 1932, Nazis were definitely persecuting the Catholic Church because they wanted to force them in line, force them behind the Nazi Party. It worked. They signed the Reichskonkordat July 20th, 1933, and things were okay until 1935, and things started really going downhill from that point. 1935, a bunch of quote-unquote morality trials start, where Hitler, you know, we'll hit the morality trials in a minute. It was smooth sailing from 33 to 35 for Catholics for the most part, especially so if you were a supporter of the regime. If you were just dead silent about it, it was pretty much smooth sailing, which is extremely unusual. Almost nobody could control an organization that was not Nazi led or not Nazi ruled or whatever, like the Hitler Youth, for example. Nobody could have an after-school club except the Catholics uniquely.
They had split the nation into 100 pieces, and then one by one, they had destroyed the pieces.
Well, they split them into 100 pieces and then absorbed them.
Over these broken pieces, the Nazis rode into power. One party, one nation, one religion.
Hilariously, Hitler framed himself as the unity candidate. Imagine that shit. He was going to unite the country. Well, I guess he kind of did, but, you know, it was by force rather than because he was actually a good leader. He was actually not a good leader. He was a terrible leader. He only ever made it to corporal in World War I, which, not knocking corporals, but you're not qualified to make military decisions at the level of corporal anyway. He was just an idiot. He was an idiot whose only distinguishing quality was he was out of his mind obsessed with hate, like with destroying certain types of people, hating anybody at any cost, no matter what, for any reason.
These men had won their struggle for power.
On the left, Hitler. To the right of him is, I'm not actually sure who that would be. To the right of that person is Goebbels, and then on the far right, I believe, is probably Göring. And the reason I think it's Göring is because he's very large. Göring was a big guy, and he was also in the Air Force. He was the head of the Luftwaffe. The guy second from the left might be Himmler. Maybe they're depicting Himmler. Those are the four big famous people in the administration. In fact, there's a song about it. It's called Hitler's Only Got One Ball. It was sung by school children in Britain. I'd be willing to bet you know the tune to it. You may not even know the song, but you know the tune. I'd put money on it. Hitler has only got one ball. Göring has two, but very small. Göring was his second in command, eventually head of the Luftwaffe, temporarily head of the Gestapo for a while. Himmler is rather similar, chief architect of the Holocaust. But poor old Goebbels has no balls at all. Propaganda minister. That's funny, right? So here's the song. This is the tune.
Hitler has only got one ball. Göring has two but very small. Hitler has something similar, but poor old Goebbels has no balls at all.
That's interesting, right? You know the tune, right? I knew the tune from when I was little. I had no idea what it was to, though. That's so fascinating. Mike Thole, I'd heard the Three Arrows mentioned on a couple of Vosh streams. I never knew what it referred to until now. Much obliged for your synopsis. Absolutely, yeah, I didn't know either until I started studying the subject. Again, was Hitler an atheist? On Amazon and Audible, give it a look. So I believe it's Hitler on the left, then Himmler, then Goebbels, then Göring. That's what I'm guessing they're portraying here. Yeah, Himmler, the reason I'm not sure that this is supposed to be Himmler is because Himmler looked like a complete fucking weasel. He was a weasel. That's neither here nor there, I'm sorry. I'm getting riled up over Himmler over here.
They now ruled all of Germany. But still they had trouble with their oldest and most persistent enemy, the truth. They found that truth does not die easily. And so they decided to abolish truth. One great source of truth is literature. So they burned books. 20 million of them. Many great men in Germany who were spokesmen for truth were jailed or driven from their country. Teachers, writers, scientists. Education was discouraged. In 5 years, college attendance dropped 53%.
Yeah, not only that, that's really important too, right there, what they just said. Think about that. The Republican Party is discouraging college education, like right now as we speak, first of all. And second, these book burnings and things, as Nerical says, there are a ton of right-wing pastors that do this today. Like Greg Locke, for example, does this. He burns books and other materials he deems occultic, discourages college education and everything else.
Throw it in. Don't breathe that mess back into you. All right, let that stuff burn. Let it go. But we're gonna start this up. We got all kind of Masonic stuff. We got devilish stuff. We got every bit of kind of witchcraft, spell books, everything you can imagine. And this thing is full. So
if you caught it there, he said we have Masonic stuff, devil stuff, Masonic stuff. Because if you remember, you know, the Nazis didn't like the Freemasons. Greg Locke also doesn't like the Freemasons or the Catholics.
We got clothes, a lot of things. So if you need to get rid of it, as much as you can get, just start throwing it in there. 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 Burn it.
And here's his reaction to people like pointing out that this is like some Hitler shit right here.
We're not going to give up, because you know what happens? We've got all kind of death threats. We got people angry. We got people threatening to do everything you can imagine. Homeland Security.
So suddenly he's the victim of this situation. He's trying to flip it around on you. Such a joke, dude. You're burning books, okay? And things like that. Burning pieces of culture. Why? Because you're like a Nazi. That's why. You burn shit like that. You are like, you're doing things that Nazis reveled in, that they instructed people to do. How do you feel about that, Greg?
Imagine Homeland Security, people calling us American terrorists, and
yeah,
Taliban, which, by the way, shall I say this about the Taliban? Did you know that Islam, they burn stuff in their religion too?
And so you're okay with being like Islam is what you're telling me? You're okay with being like the Taliban? You're fine with that?
Stuff in their religion too that they deem occultic, and ain't nobody doing stories about them, are they?
That's because they're not in Mount Juliet, Tennessee burning shit. Okay? It doesn't immediately affect my life that the Taliban is burning shit. Yeah, I don't like that, but they are their own sovereign government that I have zero control over. I do, however, have control over what happens in the United States through my vote, if nothing else, and through protest. And I see your ass burning things like the Taliban over here. Does he not expect people to, like, complain about this, really? And also, we're not talking about the Taliban. We're talking about you and what you are doing.
Let that settle in. No, they've come against an evangelical, Bible-preaching, Bible-believing church in Middle Tennessee
that burns things. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So I get a little sidetracked there. Additionally, about the education system and everything, they discouraged education, and they also shunned other fields of study that were not German. So they try to come up with their own version of mathematics, really. And the version they came up with was basically, it resembled geometry, because geometry is manly, you see. Manly and German and soldierly, because it represents the human form. I'm not joking. That's what they said. They did come up with like a unique method of calculating things or whatever, but worldwide mathematicians looked at their new form of math and said, this doesn't make any sense. This is stupid. This isn't getting us any further. It's not advancing the field at all. It's just nonsense. So it was largely discarded. And, you know, maybe they could have, like, maintained it and like, really pushed it and legitimized it if they had more time than just, like, 12 years or whatever. From 1933 to 1945 is how long the Third Reich lasted. But they only had that amount of time. And you need more time than that to legitimize something. They also tried to legitimize their own version of physics. They also famously talked mad shit about Einstein. Oh, it was so funny. Again, I talk about that in my book, Was Hitler an Atheist? Amazon and Audible. Einstein was a Jewish person from Germany, fled Germany, moved to the United States, came up with the theory of relativity. Oh, they weren't happy about that one. All right, here, this is a quote. The Westphalian Protestant Sunday paper, not a German Christian publication or the anti-Semitic version of Christianity. It wasn't the Nazified Christian publication. Titled Friede und Freude, Peace and Joy, expressed its anti-Semitism by ridiculing Albert Einstein. Quote, it's not necessary to say anything more about Mr. Einstein. At the time he advanced his theory of relativity, he achieved only limited renown, despite the feverish efforts of his Jewish friends, for there were physicists of non-Semitic origin whose service to science was substantially greater, even if they did not surround themselves with such ballyhoo. But now Professor Einstein has reached his goal. He's become immortal. Immortally ridiculous. That's from And the Witnesses Were Silent, page 67, by Wolfgang Gerlach. Anyway, they made fun of Einstein, and it was just so stupid. Yeah, they try to come up with their own version of everything, even art. And they were so ridiculous and stupid. It's like how we look at Donald Trump today. He's just like a ridiculous moron, right? Like he wears makeup like a clown. He's funny like a clown, not like, oh, you make good jokes, but you're an idiot, so we laugh at you. That's kind of how the Nazi Party was. But somehow they made it like all the way to the top. And in the process, discouraged school, discouraged education, tried to form out their own version of math and physics and their own artwork and their own everything, and failed miserably along the way.
In 5 years, college attendance dropped 53%. It was forbidden to listen to a British radio program or read an American newspaper. In Nazi Germany,
Yeah, they couldn't control the British airwaves, so BBC was coming through German radios, but the Gestapo tapped every phone line, listened to every conversation, and people were afraid that they were listening to them through the walls. So if they wanted to listen to BBC radio, they had to, some people would cover themselves on a chair with a blanket and put the radio right next to their ear and turn it all the way down so that they could listen to British news for fear they'd be caught.
to get your information from Dr. Goebbels. He knew what was best for you. You couldn't see this movie or listen to this music.
Yeah, they had their own music, too. Their own art, their own physics, math, and music. And Goebbels, you know, all of the radio shows were run by Goebbels. And he explicitly instructed the hosts of the radio shows to be entertaining, not to inundate people with Nazi propaganda 24/7. He basically said, I don't know that he said this explicitly, but he recognized that propaganda, good propaganda, is 90% truth, 10% lies. So he wanted to create 90% entertainment, 10% indoctrination, pretty much. If people stopped, if they lost interest in what the Nazi radio shows were talking about or doing, people would find something else to do instead. They'd work on like a crossword puzzle or something, rather than listening to propaganda.
And you couldn't watch Joe Louis fight because the champion had black skin. He disproved Hitler's theory of Nordic supremacy.
Yeah, but eventually they came up with an explanation. Well, they being like right-wing extremists, particularly American right-wing extremists, came up with an explanation for why whites weren't superior in this way, and it's because whites bred black people through slavery to be strong. So that's how they're, you know, it's just nonsensical garbage all the way down. FYI, evolution does not work that quickly. It's just complete garbage.
Albert Einstein, one of the world's great scientists, disproved that theory too. He was non-Aryan, so he had to leave Germany. His mind was dedicated to the search for truth, and the Nazis, having sold a lie, were most afraid of truth.
He almost got caught, too. He was trying to prove one of his theories about gravitational lensing or something, I think. And if he could use a telescope to look at the sun during a solar eclipse when the moon was crossing by, and he could see stars behind the sun, then it would prove that his theories were correct because gravity was bending light around it. Anyway, he had to be in a very specific location at a specific time to do this, and it was disrupted by the Nazi regime. I don't remember exactly what happened. You have to look into it more, but he almost got caught, and he had to wait another like 12 years or something before he could test it again.
The church was one force in Germany still strong enough to proclaim the truth in public.
No, I'm not sure what they're talking about here. No. I mean, they were strong enough for that, but they didn't. I'm not sure which year they're talking about here. I'm assuming they're talking about like 33 to 35. During this period of time, the Protestant church was all in for Nazis. 20% of the Protestant church or so were German Christians, the Nazified version. They adhered to positive Christianity, de-Judaized Christianity, 20%. 10% or so were confessing church members who were opposed to Nazi ideology. And, well, let me rephrase. I'm sorry. They were opposed to Nazi state interference in church business. The majority of the confessing church were actually Nazis themselves. They just believed that Nazis should stay out of church affairs. And the other 70% or so were what's called intact churches. They're just along for the ride. They believed a little bit from the confessing church, a little bit from positive Christianity, and they just did their thing for the most part. There's almost zero pushback, including from the Catholic Church, of course. The Catholic Church signed the Reichskonkordat agreeing to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler. Bishops, priests, everybody, all the way up the chain. So I'm not sure what this is talking about. This is inaccurate. Again, I have plenty of sources for this. I assume they're talking about Catholicism here since Catholic is right on the... We'll get to the morality trials in a second, though. For the record, the church did have more freedom to speak and debate and argue over Nazi ideology than any other group in society for longer. So the Catholic newspaper was basically banned finally in 1941. That was way down the line. That was a surprisingly long time before it was totally banned. By 1933, early 33, the Protestant church introduced the Aryan paragraph, which is a paragraph of law from Germany that basically banned Jews or non-Aryans from being involved in civil service, like police officers, firefighters, whatever. Banned them from being involved. And the church, the Protestant church, 28 districts total, banded together and implemented the Aryan paragraph in their system. So now, if you were not full-blooded Aryan, you couldn't be a minister, either a preacher or a bishop or anybody anywhere along the line. By 1934, they started moving back even further. Now, non-Aryans or people that were married to non-Aryans or anybody who had a grandparent who had gone to a synagogue or anything, a one drop of Jewish blood, quote unquote. If you fell into that category, not only could you not be a minister, but now you had to sit in your own separate pews in churches. And then it moved to you have to create your own churches. And then finally it moved to firebombing those churches and imprisoning everybody that went there.
In public.
No doubt is possible that we Christians are in a grave battle. Against us stands a faith out of blood. The battle signals range from cool repudiation to hate-filled causes. Weapons are used that centuries have dulled. The aim of this battle...
I don't know what that means. Weapons are used that centuries have dulled?
...is to dislodge Christianity from our fatherland.
This Catholic priest was arrested the following day on charges of immorality.
Yeah, that was a big thing in Germany at the time, morality trials, and it really ramped up around 1935. It got real big at the time. And the morality trials were basically accusations against Catholic priests that they were taking advantage of little boys, basically. As historians point out today, that may have been true. That may have been accurate, a lot of that. But it was definitely politically motivated. The Nazi government would not have come after Catholic priests for that stuff, if not for the fact that it was politically beneficial to them. However, there's a reason the Nazi government accused them of taking advantage of kids rather than subversive activity to the state or apostasy or drug use or whatever. There's a reason they accuse them of that. The reason is because that was a problem among Catholic priests, obviously. A legitimate problem that should have been addressed. Unfortunately, that meant accusations of child abuse went completely uninvestigated for decades and decades after the war. It was not discussed, it was not studied, and those cases are, to this day, like, no one is talking about them. No one is looking into it, nothing. In fact, investigators had to get special permission to investigate Catholic priest impropriety against children eventually after the war. So anyway, thank you for that, Hitler. Just one more thing you f***ed up for everybody. I appreciate that one. If you want to know more about this subject, there's a book called The Pope at War by David Kurtzer. He writes about it. It's really, really good and detailed on this subject, so give that a read if you want. It's pretty long, though.
The Protestant Church also continued to try and fight for truth.
They did not. No, they didn't. What are they talking about? See, this is the thing. Nobody talked about these issues until the 80s. This came out in like 1948 or something, or 46, I don't know. This whole thing is just like nonsensical garbage, what they're saying here. The Catholic Church did not oppose the Nazis like that. The Protestant church certainly did not oppose the Nazis. They had a Reich bishop named Ludwig Müller. He was the head of the Protestant church in Germany, 28 districts, 40 to 45 million people total. Catholics had about 20 million people. 18,000 pastors in the Protestant church. 2,000 of them were opposed to the Nazis. 3,000 were explicitly, openly Nazis. And everybody else was, had some variation of the two.
He who desires liberty for himself cannot deny it to others, lest he lose what he has gained.
If the churches had done this, it may not have happened. World War II, it may not have taken place. They may not have gotten a foothold in the first place, the Nazis. They didn't do this. That's the problem.
Lose what he has gained. This is the great lesson the world can learn from Germany.
The Nazis put this man in a concentration camp.
Yeah, a lot of religious figures that were opposed to, the Nazi movement, but were still Aryans, went to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, a political concentration camp. In fact, the head of the opposition to Nazi involvement in the church, Martin Niemöller, famously wrote, first they came for the communists, and I said nothing because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists. Then they came for the trade unionists. Then they came for the Jews. And then they came for me, and no one was left to speak for me. That was Martin Niemöller, the head of the Protestant opposition to Hitler. Actually, he was in favor of Hitler. He was a Nazi. He was a supporter of the Hitler government. He just believed the church should have autonomy and state control shouldn't be a part of it, fascinatingly. And he went to Sachsenhausen concentration camp in 1937, spent 4 years there, 37 to 41. And then he was moved to a death camp, Dachau, from 41 to 45, where he sat to the end of the war. When he was in Sachsenhausen, and the war started 2 years after going to Sachsenhausen, he wrote the Gestapo requesting permission to join the Navy, the German Navy, to fight the Allies. Not even joking. When he was in Dachau, he was placed in a privileged cell along with other high-profile religious figures who, if they died, there'd be a lot of outrage. And his cell was right in view of the Nazi torture cells. So he sat there and watched Nazis torture people all day, every day. And he still believed in the Nazi cause. All the way until after the war. I think 1946. The war ended mid-1945. It was shortly after the war ended. He goes to Dachau to show his wife and daughter the cell that he spent, years in. And as he approaches, he sees a sign painted on a tree that basically says, here, 200,000 people were cremated, something to that effect. And he turns to his daughter and he says, I have an alibi for 1937 to 1945, but where was I from 1933 to 1937, basically? That's the moment when he decided that Nazis were bad. After the war. After sitting there for 4 years watching people get tortured in front of him. After going to Sachsenhausen concentration camp and applying to be in the German Navy and everything. After all of that shit. Then he decided that he didn't stand for any of it. So anyway, it was full of Nazis. Like, even the church opposition. Full of Nazis. Again, was Hitler an atheist? OwenMorgan.com. It's on Audible and Amazon. I'm going to keep harping on this.
Concentration camp. There were others who spoke for truth, and I am proud to say that educators were among them.
No. This is so fascinating. No. Teachers disproportionately supported the Nazi cause. Like, more than you would expect. Which is super odd to me. It's like really weird that teachers would support the Nazi cause, right?
And what, may I ask, is an Aryan? I don't know myself.
It's not real.
But let us see what our present so-called authorities have to say about it. They say he is tall.
They're looking at Goebbels. Strong specimen of a man, right?
Slender.
Goring, famously fat. And look at this pose he's making. I love that.
Blue-eyed.
I think this is Rudolf Hess. And he was basically the head of the official Nazi party, like the deputy chief or whatever. I think that's who this is.
And blonde.
And Hitler, of course.
There is no Aryan race. And more important, there is no master race. There are people who may find these ideas convenient, but science cannot support them. There is no scientific proof that there's any correlation between a man's racial characteristics and his native ability or character. In all racial groups, we find the same range of potentialities. We find idiots and geniuses. We find criminals and philanthropists. We must judge each man as an individual and not by the color of his skin or his eyes or by the length of his nose.
And somebody denounced him, presumably. He's standing there giving this speech about how Aryanism is fake, as a professor should, right? And somebody denounces him, presumably. Nazis come in to arrest him. That's a scary sight right there. To the concentration camp with you.
Come in, gentlemen. Make yourselves comfortable.
Yeah, I'd be gulping too. Oh my God, dude. Your life is over. You're likely going to die now.
There are many differences between individuals. We each have different capabilities, different backgrounds, different views about what's right and what's wrong. Like the difference between me and these gentlemen who have just arrived. But that is not the difference in race. It is a difference in the way we think. Remember that.
Look at these fine specimen of men right here, right? They exude manliness. They are the pinnacle of manliness, right? Especially the guy on the right. Peak man.
Remember that. And remember that there is no master race. That is a scientific truth. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying.
Pretty much how it happened, yep.
And so for all practical purposes, truth had been abolished in Germany. A lot of my German friends wondered what had hit them. How did it happen? Where did it start? It started right here. And this was where it could have been stopped. If those people had stood together, if they had protected each other, they could have resisted the Nazi threat. Together they would have been strong, but once they allowed themselves to be split apart, they were helpless.
Yep, we're all Americans. They were all Germans. Jews and everybody, all of them. They were Germans, and they were split off one by one.
When that first minority lost out, everybody lost out. They made the mistake of gambling with other people's freedom. Now let's see how those bets paid off. Karl the farmer was gambling on a better life for himself. What he got was extra hours of back-breaking work, as much as 100 hours a week. He was forced to stay on his land and produce what he was told to produce, because now Hitler was preparing for war. For Heinrich, who owned a hardware store, the bet didn't pay off either. 104,000 small businesses were closed in 2 years. And for Hans, conditions hadn't improved any. He had a job now in the munitions factory, but he worked long hours for little pay. The working conditions grew increasingly bad. And even though he didn't like the job, he wasn't permitted to leave it.
Yeah, that's true. That's part of corporatism, which is kind of what replaced capitalism. I mean, capitalism wasn't really replaced exactly in Germany, but effectively corporatism was like integrated into capitalism. It's like if Google and Apple and Amazon and Facebook all got together to write the legislation, like the legal framework for how companies should be regulated. That's what corporatism is. And that was kind of the ideal replacement for capitalism within a fascist system. That started, I believe, under Italy originally and continued on under Hitler's regime, of course. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, one of the main proponents of the folkish ideology, was very opposed to capitalism, did not like capitalism. However, Nazis didn't have a problem with capitalism necessarily. They did try to kind of integrate a corporatist system into their economic framework, but it was still very much capitalist. Part of the corporatist kind of rules, though, is that the state determines when it's okay to hire or fire somebody. And, of course, the state regulations are controlled by the companies, a board of companies, basically. So, anyway, it's a complicated system. But the bottom line is that it's not exactly capitalism. It's basically the worst qualities of capitalism all wrapped into one. Like, pick out everything bad about capitalism and stick that into one prepackaged system, and there you have corporatism.
There still wasn't enough food in his house. Hitler said you couldn't have butter and cannon. So Hans couldn't have butter. And when Hitler decided the time was right, Germany went to war. Not by declaring war, but by a carefully prepared sneak attack.
Yep, and justified it by claiming that Poland was persecuting Germans. I mean, real ridiculous stuff.
Once again, Hitler needed Hans to do his dirty work. Hans was an expert at brutality by this time. And Hitler had decided to use Hans and his brutality against other peoples, the Czechs, the Poles, the French, the Russians. But in the crucial test of war, Hitler's race theories didn't pay off. His pure-blooded supermen were defeated by the mongrel armies.
Ubermensch, yeah. They didn't understand how that could have happened. They didn't get it. We're Aryan. We're superior. How is it that we could have lost this war? How can we lose any battle? That makes no sense at all. That's the mindset they were in.
He despised by the British at El Alamein.
The reason Hitler won is because he caught them with their pants down. That's it. If they had realized that Hitler was doing what he was doing, he never would have stood a chance.
By the Russians at Stalingrad.
The first major battle against Russia, or against the USSR, I guess is what it was at the time. The first major battle was a surprise. Stalin didn't believe that Hitler was going to attack him because that was like a ridiculous notion. Like, you're gonna what? A guy swims across a river to warn Stalin. He swims across and he says, they're coming right now. I can see them. Stalin has him shot in the head for spreading misinformation. And next thing you know, here they are. Germans are coming over. And the first thing that Germans did was cut communications, basically. And the field marshals, like, Stalin was brutal. He was real brutal. In fact, more people died at the hands of Stalin within Russia or the USSR than died at the hands of Hitler within Germany. The field marshals were afraid of what it would mean if they retreated. So instead of retreating after losing communications and being unable to, like, orchestrate a plan, they ran straight toward the army. They ran straight toward the Germans, and they were slaughtered, just killed en masse. You know, it looks like Stalin's strategy was to just throw people at the problem until it worked. He wasn't a good strategist, actually, but the real problem was that Germany got the jump on them, and Stalin stupidly didn't believe it was going to happen. So anyway, they actually attacked them in, I believe in spring, and it dragged on so long that it got to winter, and Hitler he wasn't ready for a winter war. He didn't expect it to go on that long. If any of these battles went on for long enough, then it was going to fail. If he had attacked Poland and it dragged out for more than like a few days, he would have failed. When the Russian attack dragged on into the winter, it failed.
And then on D-Day by American soldiers of every color and religion, who smashed across the Normandy beaches and drove on through to the heart of Germany. For the misguided Germans who had swallowed the Nazi bait, the Nazi game did not pay off. The continent of Europe was strewn with millions of German bodies, pure Aryan bodies. Karl the farmer was left in the snow outside of Moscow. Heinrich stayed in Italy at Salerno. And Hans, who was going to rule the world, got only a little patch of Normandy that he could call his own. We must never let that happen to us or to our country. We must never let ourselves be divided by race or color or religion, because in this country we all belong to minority groups. I was born in Hungary. You are a Mason. These are minorities. And then you belong to other minority groups too. You are a farmer. You have blue eyes. You go to the Methodist Church. Your right to belong to these minorities is a precious thing. You have a right to be what you are and say what you think, because here we have personal freedom. We have liberty. And these are not just fancy words. This is a practical and priceless way of living. But we must work at it. We must guard everyone's liberty, or we can lose our own.
See, he's tearing up the pamphlet. I appreciate that. That's good. This is such a good movie.
If we allow any minority to lose its freedom by persecution or by prejudice, we are threatening our own freedom. And this is not simply an idea. This is good, hard common sense. You see, here in America is not a question whether we tolerate minorities. America is minorities. And that means you and me.
Yeah, that's what makes us strong.
So let's not be suckers. We must not allow the freedom or dignity of any man to be threatened by any act or word.
Fantastic film.
Let's be selfish about it. Let's forget about we and they. Let's think about us.
The end. Yeah, fantastic film. Fascinating. I wish that they hadn't really twisted things around with the church. I may know more about this subject than anybody outside of a university. I've read so much about it over the past year. It's ridiculous. But as a result, I hear like a lot of nonsense and a lot of like rewriting history and twisting it around because Christians never want to face head on the wrongs that Christians perpetrated in World War II or in Germany, whatever. Anyway, yeah, tell me what you think about it in the comments. And buckle up, because the same people that made God's Not Dead have produced a movie called Bonhoeffer about the Protestant church in Germany in World War II. And you know it's propaganda. It is, of course, propaganda. And it's egregious and insane with some of the stuff that they portray. Like, the movie poster has Dietrich Bonhoeffer holding a gun. He was a pacifist to the core. It's just absurd. So anyway, yeah, buckle up for that one. Again, check out my book on Amazon and Audible, Was Hitler an Atheist? OwenMorgan.com can be found there. My other books also.